Imperium, The Philosophy of History and Politics, Part 2, Chapter 8, League of Nations. The fact that a world with one state or one government is an organic impossibility was well shown by two attempts on the part of what might be called the Holy Alliance of the 20th century to institute such a condition. After each of the first two world wars, the extra-European Holy Alliance against Europe established a League of Nations. The political organisms, however, remained organic, and thus subject to the law of sovereignty. If a political unit exists, it is sovereign. The member units of these two Leagues of Nations continued to exist politically, and thus were sovereign. Incidentally, the organic law of sovereignty is not the principle of sovereignty of nations of Grotius and Pufendorf. That was a legal concept, and thus subject to juristic quibbling, whereas the organic law of sovereignty describes all political units whatever, since it belongs to their very existence. Thus, the dilemma was that the Leagues of Nations had no sovereignty. Again, I am speaking of factual, organic sovereignty, not legal sovereignty, and hence were not political units. There is no political unit without organic sovereignty. There is no organic sovereignty without a political unit. What, then, were these two Leagues of Nations? They had two aspects, the ethical and the practical political. In terms of practical politics, they were polemical realities. Whatever power controlled them could thus speak for all nations, and thus any power opposing it was hors la loi, outside the comity of nations, not even human, for the League was humanity. They rapidly, of course, needless to say, passed into the control of certain member states, according to the law of sovereignty. Where there is no sovereignty, there is no independent political unit, and sovereignty must therefore reside elsewhere. And, in fact, the First League of Nations, formed after the First World War, passed into the control of England. The Second League of Nations, formed in a time after the Second World War, when politics had entered upon a more absolute stage, was seized by America. This was foreseeable from the fact that Russia had allowed the geographical site of it to be established in America. This was not merely to keep out the undesirable swarms of ideologues, parasites, and holiday-makers, such as necessarily accompany every League of Nations, and to keep out the spies who pullulate in such a condition, but it actually showed a limited and secondary interest in the thing. In the past, certain powers have owned certain theories. Conversely, there has never been an important theory that did not have practical, political ownership. A theory without a political unit to use it to practical purpose is not important. If the protagonists of a theory have sufficient passion and non-theoretical political skill to work up intense feeling with their theory, they will possibly attain power with such a weapon. If they reach a point just short of power, an already existing political unit will appropriate the theory for practical purposes. Example: Marxism taken over in 1918 by Bolshevik Russia for political use against Europe, when its protagonists in Germany showed themselves politically stillborn. The League of Nations theory was, in fact, owned by America. Whoever spread the idea, even England, which seized the first League, was increasing the power of America, whether he knew it or not. It was inevitable that politicians free of ideology, like the Kremlin Mongols, would see this. Since they understood how to use theories, it was obvious they would allow no political unit to hamstring them with its theory. Thus perished the second and last League of Nations. There was also an ethical aspect to these leagues. They were another example of the deception that was still thought in the first half of the 20th century to be a necessity of political conduct. They were actually nothing but polemical attempts to deny Europe. The formation of Europe as a political unit was in the spirit of the age. Whoever agitated anything else was merely negating this idea. This explains the fact that though the two Leagues of Nations accomplished nothing else as a political fact, nevertheless, they prevented Europe. This is quite independent of whether all people participating were conscious of this. However, it is the organic task of the politician to be conscious of political reality and to understand and assess rightly the possibilities of the time. It is, of course, now known that many persons who participated in these world frauds were quite conscious of the realities. From what has been said about the nature of political organisms, the relation of the statesman to his political organism is obvious. Just as he calls on his populace to die, he cannot refuse if necessary to give his own life. To his political unit he owes all his physical energies and all his talent and genius. For him to be careless in researching a situation, and above all, for him to do that which he knows is contrary to the furtherance of the life of the organism, is to forfeit his right to live. He can consider himself lucky indeed if he is able to die of a heart attack, brain concussion, blood clot, or simply old age. When the extra-European forces gradually increased their power to such an extent that the independent existence of the West became problematical, and this was evident from 1920 onward, and was transparent from 1933. It was the collective duty to their states and to the Western civilization for all statesmen in Europe to endeavor to save their respective states and Western states collectively from political annihilation by extra-European forces. Thus, any statesman in a European state who sabotaged the general West European understanding and final settlement that was sought by the custodians of the spirit of the Western civilization was a strangler and a distorter of the destiny of his own country and of that of the Western civilization. The ethics thus formulated is an ethics of fact. It is organic, political, factual, and nothing else. Its sole imperative is an organic political one. It is distinguished from religious ethics in that it has no theological sanction. It is distinguished from all ethical systems whatever in that it only sees one relationship, that of the individual to the political unit. Nor does it have a sanction in the putative sense. The organic relationship between the political unit and the statesman itself sets the ethical imperative. If the statesman violates it by injuring instead of furthering the life of the organism, the sanction is a matter for destiny, the inner force of organisms. By doing so, he forfeits his right to live, but often he is fortunate enough to escape with his life. The existential embrace of the lives of the individuals in it, which has been shown to be an essential characteristic of a political unit, makes no exception in favor of politicians. At its highest tension, this organic imperative causes a statesman in its service to tie his own life to the success of his own idea for the organism. Bismarck and Friedrich de Grosse also were determined to take their lives in the event of failure.